All right, welcome back. We are looking at medieval warfare. In part one, we had talked about causes or changes from ancient warfare to medieval warfare. And in this part, we're going to look specifically at the defensive side of siege warfare, because in part one we had talked about a lot of different things like different trebuchets and castles and siege towers and battering rams. Now we're going to talk about, if you were inside those walls, what are some of the things you can do for protection on the defensive side. Then we'll talk a little bit about knights, a little bit about naval warfare, and we'll wrap this up. So here we go. Siege warfare. Just like I did for the offensive side, I'm going to provide you a list, and then we're going to go through and walk through each one of these and kind of understand what some of the defensive capabilities people inside these castles or fortifications had. So we're going to talk about matriculations, we're going to talk about murder holes, Greek fire, arrow slits, drawbridges, portcullises, and moats. So feel free to hit pause and write those down if you have to, and I'm going to go through and talk about each one of them. So let's start with matriculations. Matriculations are a really fancy word for kind of these slits on top of your castle. Obviously, you could put scouts up there, you could put archers up there, or people just with rocks or any type of heavy object that they could throw or hurl at an invading force. Of course, you could then quickly duck behind the stone wall here for protection. So it's a very easy way to take the high ground and try to prevent an invading force from coming into your castle or fortification. Murder holes are kind of interesting around some of the entrances and various other important places in fortifications. You'll see holes like this, and they're exactly what they sound like. You can drop, hot oil down there. You can certainly try to, drop heavy rocks. Maybe even if you're lucky, get an arrow through there. But it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel at that point. If somebody's standing here trying to break into your door, there's not a lot of places they can go and hide, so these murder holes would be very useful. You can see a couple of different versions of that. Greek fire is an interesting one. Greek fire was something used by a couple of different groups, a combination of some different chemicals that would ignite it. It was almost like this gel that when you hit something with it, it was very difficult to put out. It was very hot. It was obviously it's on fire, and so what you would end up doing is burning boats, certainly causing a lot of damage both to the troops and to their equipment. So Greek fire is a very interesting one that you could use on the defensive side. Arrow slits, I think they speak for themselves. They're tall so that you can get your bow lined up with them. Certainly you could use them for scouting purposes, but you'd be very well protected. It'd be very hard to shoot an arrow through something like that on the offensive side. On the defensive side, you could stand there, line up your shot, and try to take an enemy soldier out. Portcullises, they're essentially doors, oftentimes made of wood or even iron, so they could block entrances, or you would put them down over your door, as you can see here. So your wooden door would be very susceptible to a battering ram or something like that. But now if you got this portcullis pulled down on top of it, now you've got a double layer of defense. So that naturally is going to make things a little bit more difficult for an invading army or force to get through. Moats, as suggested when we talked about castles and fortifications in part one, if you gotta go through water to get to your enemy, that's going to be very difficult to do, especially if you've got heavy armor, heavy equipment, and horses. So water is going to slow you down considerably. You're going to have to create some type of pontoon, some type of boat, some type of drawbridge in order to get in. And of course, that's going to take more time and resources, and it's going to limit your mobility, of course, as well. So moats were very useful surrounding many castles and fortifications. Knights. Knights we talk a lot about in world history. Knights were bodyguards. They believed in chivalry, which is their code that they lived by. They wanted to fight honorably. They wanted to fight bravely. So knights could definitely make a very big impact for you. So knights became your main cavalry force. You put knights on horseback with their heavy armor, and they became sort of like a tank. Very costly profession, of course, because you had to buy and make your armor. Obviously, you might have to pay a blacksmith to do that, and that's not going to be something they can make over a weekend. Some of this armor would take months to create. Of course, you had to have horses. Horses were costly to maintain. They needed food. They needed horseshoes. I mean, it wasn't just like you could just take a horse anywhere. A lot of times you needed servants to maintain your armor, to maintain your horses, all sorts of the different things that a knight would carry with them. Take a lot of time training. Some of these knights trained for decades. They were knights for life, so they definitely, had the experience. It's not like you could just become a knight over a weekend as well. I already mentioned they follow the concept of chivalry. It's like the Japanese version of Bushido, it's the European version of Bushido. Bushido was the way of the warrior for the samurai, whereas chivalry is the knight's code. And again, knights tried to live by this, to be very honorable, to be very brave, to fight loyally, and to really serve their masters. So it was all about God, landlord, and your true love. It's definitely this idea of chivalry today, to treat your lady very well, open doors for her, even in the modern world today, treating females very, very kindly. It's definitely romanticized warfare. A lot of people wanted to be knights. A lot of people wanted to be like knights. We've got all sorts of movies where knights are idolized and certainly seen as a very honorable profession. Knights lasted until the use of the longbows in the Battle of Agincourt. Longbows presented a problem for knights because longbows could pierce a lot of the armor that knights would wear, especially chainmail and things like that. So you can't a group of knights charging in, if they could be taken out by arrow, they become considerably less effective. So the longbow is going to be a game changer. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. Steps of knighthood. I'm going to talk to this really quickly. You'd start out as a page, basically educated in religion, manners, and weaponry. You'd move up to a squire at around age 14 to 21. You'd start learning more about chivalry, and you would serve the knights kind of as servants, and eventually ages 21 and up, you could actually become a knight. They ran their estates, defended the lords in battle. So you'd really move from a child, essentially, all the way up to an honorable fighter. But it would take, 7 to 10 years just to even get close to this age, and then you might fight for decades before you become really, really good. Knight tournaments, I'll go through this quickly. Knight tournaments, there was kind of the romanticized, we see this at Renaissance festivals and in movies and things like that. Purpose of knight tournaments were for practice, finding jobs, making a few bucks on the side, things like that. Certainly you could gain wealth if you were really, really good. All right, some of the unique equipment from the Middle Ages. One of the things that you want to have is some type of blunt object. That might involve a spear. It might involve something heavy like a hammer. Typically they were made out of some type of iron, something that could withstand a whole bunch of hits in battle. But your variation here is not very big. I mean, you look at the military fork here, they're pretty much all the same. They're just this very slight variation to them. Horseman's pick, I think we saw this in Braveheart. It's almost like a big hammer, so whatever side you get hit by, it's going to cause a lot of damage. You've got your flail here, which is like a three-pronged mace. The halberd, which is almost like a giant battle axe, but it also can be used as a spear. You've got the longbow, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Crossbows became big. Crossbows were very powerful, but they took a lot of time to reload, whereas a bow, you could simply just grab another arrow out of your quiver and move along. So, and of course, this is all in addition to your standard sword and shield that many medieval knights and fighters used. Problem is, when you're talking about any type of metal, whether it's iron or even eventually steel, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So there's definitely a drawback to this. There was an incredible variety, as I showed you on the previous slide, but they were very, very heavy. Carrying your armor, carrying your weapons could be upwards of 100 pounds or more. And naturally, that's why you would have needed a horse and servants to come with you as well. So it's not like you could just ride off into battle whenever you wanted to. Some knights had two sets of armor. you had your battle armor and you had your parade armor. Your battle armor was pretty standard metal, kind of like what you see here to cover your body, but I'll show you what parade armor would look like. Parade armor was almost more for dignitaries, for show, especially the older you got, the more expensive armor you could have. So this would have been for like distinguished knights who had, won a lot of battles, gained a lot of wealth, and were kind of seen as the upper echelon of knights. So you didn't see a lot of this, but it definitely existed. Naval warfare. Naval warfare still is not a big part of warfare. We talked about this in ancient warfare, that you definitely didn't want to go out in open oceans. You didn't do that, and you had to have calm days. Same goes here in the Middle Ages. For medieval warfare, naval warfare was mostly used for transportation of troops. You didn't do a lot of fighting on the seas. That's why when you talk about the Greeks having their triremes, or even the Romans having their quinqueremes, they were kind of the best of the best, because not a lot of other people wanted to fight at sea. It just was a very costly and very dangerous thing to do. So like I said, it's very similar to ancient warfare. You would try to board and conquer, so you didn't necessarily have cannons or projectiles. You try to get on the enemy ship and you try to take them out there. You can imagine how difficult that would actually be. And boats were not made for open water. So it's not going to be more towards modern warfare and the use of gunpowder that you're going to see naval warfare become something more of a regular occurrence in battles. All right, so we'll end here with the end of medieval warfare. I mean, eventually there's got to be a change, right? I told you the longbow is going to be a part of that. The invention and the use of the longbow in the mid-1300s is a game changer, because now a lot of the armor and chainmail that different knights wore could not always protect you. The longbow was very powerful. It could be shot several hundred yards at relative accuracy if you were good at it. And so it would just definitely change the way you would use siege warfare and any type of knights on the battlefield. So it led to the fall of the knight. You don't see as many knights being used anymore. Some of the important battles, and I'm not going to talk about these, would be Crécy, Agincourt, and Poitiers. But the big game changer, the one that really alters medieval warfare, and I would say the modern warfare in the modern world completely, is gunpowder. The invention and use of gunpowder is going to make all types of warfare before it almost obsolete. You're not going to see many swords anymore. You're not going to see shields anymore. You're just going to see muskets and rifles and eventually smart bombs and everything in between. Because a lot of these guns, you needed two arms to fire them, unless you're talking about some type of handgun. So you couldn't carry a shield. You obviously wouldn't carry a sword. The best you could do is have a bayonet on the end of your gun. So gunpowder comes from China, travels through the Silk Road and with the Mongol conquest in the 1400s, and it's really just going to alter everything. So it started in the 14th century in Europe and bombards in the 15th century. So right around by the 1400s, the medieval way of fighting is completely over with. Now that people can use bombs and cannons and everything else, it's really going to, and eventually to the muskets and rifles I was talking about, it really just does, it makes medieval warfare primitive at that point. It leads to the fall of Constantinople. The Ottoman Turks will take over Constantinople and rename it Istanbul as part of this. You can see the spread of gunpowder coming here from East Asia and from China, traveling on the Silk Roads, which would have been right here, and making its way into Europe this way. Spread of gunpowder. And what you see in orange here is the Mongol Empire that I mentioned a couple of different times. If you don't know about the Mongols, you'll learn about them in world history when you're a junior. All right, let's wrap things up by taking a second look at our learning targets. Our question said, summarize the warfare techniques and strategies used in the medieval world. Well, we have lots of unique equipment, lots of offensive strategies, defensive strategies that we looked at in today's lecture that we can use to answer that question. We're also going to continue to look at the second question, compare and contrast ancient, medieval, and modern warfare based on Sun Tzu's principles. We've got Sun Tzu's principles from our Art of War viewing guide. So we'll definitely use those as sort of our backbone to answer that question, but we still need to look at modern warfare to really have a good idea. So what you would do to answer this question, of course, is use Sun Tzu's principles and see how they fit into each of ancient, modern, and medieval warfare. So next time around, we're going to take a look at modern warfare, and that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.